Silence is rarely neutral. We like to think of it as simply an absence of words, a gap in communication. But in reality, it's almost always saying something. When someone stops engaging, stops initiating, or stops showing up in the way they used to, that isn't just a random glitch in the connection. It's a signal that they have made some sort of decision about how they see you, how they value the relationship, or what place you hold in their life. The decision might be subtle. It might not be a clean, conscious, I'm done with this. It could be quieter than that, more like, I'll keep them around, but they're not a priority, or I'll respond when I have time, but I'm not going to go out of my way, or even I'm still here physically, but emotionally, I'm checking out. That's the tricky thing about silence. It's not always total abandonment. Sometimes it's the soft withdrawal, the quiet shift from present and engaged to distant and detached. And when you're on the receiving end of that shift, your instinct is often to give them the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself they're busy, tired, going through something personal, and sometimes, yes, that's true. But when the silence becomes a pattern, when the absence of effort starts to replace the presence of connection, you have to consider that this isn't a temporary dip. It's a decision. We don't like thinking about it this way because it forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. If they've made a decision, it means they've already done a calculation about your value in their life. And maybe that calculation has shifted. Maybe at one point they saw you as central and now they see you as optional. That's painful to admit. But until you admit it, you'll keep misreading the signs. Think about it, most big decisions aren't announced. In relationships, very few people will sit you down and say, I've decided to lower my investment in you. They'll simply start behaving differently, and silence is one of the clearest behavioral shifts you can get. That's why ignoring it is so dangerous. Silence tells you they are either unable or unwilling to give more. In either case, the effect is the same. You end up with less. And if you don't recognize that as a decision, you'll respond in all the wrong way. You'll send more messages, you'll make more plans, you'll try harder to get their attention, thinking you can reverse the drift. But every time you overextend, you teach them something. You teach them that they can give less and still keep you. When someone has made a decision about you, they test it by changing their behavior. If you respond by accepting the reduced effort and compensating for it, you confirm their choice. You reinforce the idea that you'll stay, regardless of how much they show up. That's why recognizing silence as a decision is so powerful. It stops you from walking straight into that trap. Another reason this is so important is because silence doesn't just communicate about them, it also reflects something about you. The way you respond to someone's silence says a lot about your boundaries, your self-respect, and your standards for connection. If you're so afraid of losing them that you tolerate the quiet indefinitely, you're sending a message not just to them, but to yourself, that your need for clarity and consistency isn't as important as keeping them around. That's why reframing silence as a decision is essential for your self-worth. Instead of thinking, they're quiet, I must have done something wrong, you start thinking, they're quiet. That means they've shifted their investment. Now I have to decide if that works for me. That one shift puts you back in control. It stops you from clinging to the hope that maybe if you try hard enough, you can drag the relationship back to where it was. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. When someone's quiet, it's not that they can't speak, it's that they're choosing not to. They could send a message, make a call, or show up for you. They're capable, but they're not prioritizing, and that choice, whether temporary or permanent, is a reflection of where you stand in their mind right now. It's also worth saying, silence can be a form of clarity. You may not get the closure you want in a neatly wrapped conversation, but the lack of action tells you everything you need to know about their level of interest, commitment, or care. People who want to be in your life will make that known. They won't risk letting you wonder where you stand. Understanding that silence is a decision doesn't mean you immediately cut people off the moment they go quiet. It means you become aware enough to adjust your behavior. You stop over-investing, you match their pace instead of sprinting ahead. You don't give more to someone who's giving you less. In doing so, you create space for one of two things to happen. Either they realize the distance and close it, or they let the distance grow, which saves you from wasting months or years on someone who is already halfway out the door. The difficulty here is emotion. We're wired to chase connection when we feel it's slipping. We think if we just explain ourselves, if we just remind them of the good times, if we just put in a little extra, they'll come back. But when silence is already a decision, those actions don't rebuild the bridge. They simply confirm you're willing to cross it alone. Seeing silence for what it is forces you to be honest about the state of the relationship. It strips away the illusions we build to keep hope alive, and while that honesty might hurt in the moment, it's the only thing that protects you from slowly eroding your own value by holding on to someone who's already let go in their mind. Once you start interpreting silence as a decision rather than an absence, you no longer take it personally in a way that makes you shrink. You see it as information. You let it inform your own decision about how much of yourself you're willing to give. You understand that communication isn't just about words, it's about patterns, consistency and effort. And when those things disappear, it's rarely an accident. When someone begins to pull away, your instincts often push you in the opposite direction. You feel the urge to lean in, to bridge the gap, to fix whatever is breaking. You send more messages, you offer more of your time, you make yourself more available. Deep down, you think that if you can just show them how committed you are, if you can remind them of the connection you share, they'll return to how they used to be. But this is one of the most common traps people fall into when someone's energy starts to fade, because in reality, overcompensating for their distance rarely pulls them back. Instead, it almost always confirms the very decision that made them withdraw in the first place. The reason this happens comes down to how human behavior works. When someone begins to give less, it's usually because they've already shifted their emotional investment. Maybe they've decided consciously or unconsciously that you're not as much of a priority. Maybe they've become distracted by other people or other parts of their life. Maybe they've decided that you're willing to do most of the work so they don't have to. Whatever the reason, their reduced effort is not an accident, it's a choice. And when you respond by giving more to make up for their less, you're effectively telling them that choice was correct. Imagine this like a balanced scale. In the beginning, both of you were putting in equal weight, equal effort, equal attention, equal presence. But then one day they remove some of their weight from the scale. Instead of letting the imbalance show, instead of allowing them to see the effect of their withdrawal, you rush to add more of your own weight to keep the scale level. The problem is, they now get the benefit of a balanced scale without having to contribute the same amount. They feel the comfort of a relationship without having to make the effort that comfort should require. This is why matching energy is so important. Matching energy isn't about playing games, it's about preserving the natural feedback loops in a relationship. When someone gives less, and you match their reduced pace, they feel the difference. They notice the absence of your usual presence. They see that their actions have consequences. That moment of awareness is often the only thing that prompts them to reassess and decide whether they truly want to invest again. But when you overcompensate, you remove that moment entirely. They never feel the gap, so they never feel the need to close. Overcompensating can also create a dangerous dynamic, where the relationship becomes one-sided without you even realizing it. You begin to take on both roles. You're the one initiating, maintaining and repairing the connection. You're carrying the emotional labor for two people. And while you may feel noble or loving for doing this, over time it breeds resentment and erodes your self-respect. You start to notice the imbalance, but by then, the other person is used to you doing the work, so they have no incentive to change. It's important to understand that people are not motivated by what we say we need, they're motivated by the reality of what we accept. You can tell someone, I want more effort, but if you continue to give them all the attention, validation and access they want, while they give you less, your actions contradict your words. They believe you'll stay regardless, so your request for more effort becomes background noise. Matching their energy, on the other hand, communicates your boundaries without confrontation. If they send fewer messages, you don't flood them with double the amount. If they stop initiating plans, you stop scheduling everything for them. You allow the space they've created to exist. This isn't about punishing them, it's about protecting your own energy and sending a clear signal that you expect reciprocity. The challenge is emotional discipline. When you care about someone, your instinct is to close the gap they create. It feels uncomfortable to pull back when you still want to move closer. It feels risky, as though if you don't chase them they might slip away completely. But this is where you have to remember the deeper truth. If your connection is so fragile that it depends on you overextending yourself to keep it alive, then it was never strong enough to sustain you in the long term. By refusing to overcompensate, you give the relationship a chance to reveal its true nature. One of two things will happen. Either the other person notices your absence and steps forward to match you again, or they let the distance remain, confirming that they were never going to meet you half. Both outcomes are valuable because they give you clarity without forcing you to beg for answers. There's another reason overcompensating is dangerous. It distorts your sense of worth. When you start pouring more energy into someone than they're giving to you, you're subconsciously telling yourself that you have to earn their attention, that their presence is something you must work harder for. And once that belief takes root, it changes the way you show up in every interaction. You stop expressing your authentic self and start performing for approval. You suppress your needs to avoid rocking the boat. You tolerate inconsistencies you would never accept from someone new. Matching energy flips that dynamic on its head. It tells your subconscious, I am worthy of mutual effort. If you can't meet me here, I won't lower myself to keep you. That's not arrogance, it's self-respect. And self-respect is the foundation of any healthy relationship, because it sets the tone for how others treat you. Overcompensating might feel like love in the moment, but love that's built on self-abandonment can't last. Real love exists in balance, both people reaching toward each other, both people willing to close the gap when it appears. When you match energy instead of overcompensating, you create the conditions for that balance to return. You stop enabling their withdrawal and start allowing them to feel the weight of their own choice. And in that space, they have to decide whether they truly want to step back in, or whether they're content to let you go. Space makes most people uncomfortable. When you feel connected to someone and that connection begins to weaken, the idea of putting distance between you feels like the opposite of what you should do. You're tempted to close the gap as quickly as possible, send a text, make a call, plan a meetup, anything to restore that feeling of closeness. But this instinct often works against you because space is not your enemy. Space is the place where truth reveals itself. When you stop filling every silence with action, you allow the other person's feelings to surface without your influence. If they care, if they value the connection, that space becomes uncomfortable for them. They begin to notice your absence. They think about the moments you would normally reach out. They miss the validation, the attention, the warmth you provide. This is the moment when desire rebuilds, not in the noise of constant interaction, but in the quiet where they can feel the difference between life with you and life without you. But the other possibility is just as important. Space can confirm that they don't feel enough to come close. It can show you without words that they were already slipping away and that nothing you did or didn't do was going to change that. This is why space is so valuable. It doesn't just keep you from chasing, it also saves you from wasting energy on someone who has no intention of meeting you halfway. Either they step forward, or they let the distance grow, and in both cases you have your answer. The problem is that most people are afraid of what that answer might be. They think if I give space they might forget about me. But here's the truth, if someone can forget about you just because you stop initiating, then they were never deeply invested to begin with. You're not risking a real connection by creating space, you're testing whether it was real at all. Space works because it disrupts the comfort they've been enjoying. When someone starts giving less, and you respond by continuing to give the same or more, they get the best of both worlds. The security of your presence, without the effort of maintaining it. They don't feel any loss, because you've removed the natural consequences of their withdrawal. Space restores those consequences. It forces them to confront the reality of what happens when they don't show up.
For you, space also provides clarity. When you're caught in the cycle of chasing someone's attention, your mind is too busy reacting to notice the bigger picture. You're focused on their last message, their tone of voice, their level of enthusiasm in a single conversation. But when you step back, you begin to see the overall pattern. You notice whether they make any effort without your prompting. You see if they try to bridge the distance, or if they're perfectly content to let it remain. It's important to remember that creating space is not the same as playing games. You're not withholding affection to manipulate them. You're simply stepping back to allow the relationship to breathe without you propping it up. This isn't about testing them in a petty way. It's about letting their actions reflect their true intentions. And space isn't always physical. It can be emotional too. You can still be in contact with someone and create space by reducing how much emotional energy you invest. You might still reply, but you stop oversharing. You might still see them, but you stop rearranging your schedule to make it happen. You match their level of effort, giving the connection room to either strengthen on its own or fade without you forcing it. The beauty of space is that it shifts the dynamic from pursuit to balance. When you're constantly filling the gap,
You're taking responsibility for both sides of the relationship. Space hands that responsibility back to them. It says this connection isn't just mine to maintain, it's ours. And if you're not willing to do your part, it won't survive. That's not cruelty, that's fairness. There's also a deeper benefit. Space allows you to reconnect with yourself. When you're wrapped up in trying to hold someone's attention, you can lose sight of your own life, your own needs, your own joy. Stepping back gives you time and mental bandwidth to focus on things that feed you. You start investing in hobbies, friends, goals, and experiences that have nothing to do with them. This not only makes you happier, but it also makes you less dependent on their responses for your sense of worth. Ironically, this self-focus is often what reignites attraction. People are drawn to those who have a life outside of them, who aren't anxiously waiting for the next message. When they see that you're thriving without constant contact, it challenges their assumption. They begin to realize that your presence is not guaranteed, and that realization can spark a desire to re-engage. However, even if they don't return, you still win, because you've used the space to build a stronger relationship with yourself. You've learned that your peace doesn't depend on someone else's consistency. You've learned that you can handle uncertainty without trying to control it. You've learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for a connection is to stop trying to control it at all. The fear of space comes from a scarcity mindset. The belief that if you're not constantly securing someone's attention, you'll lose them forever. But healthy relationships aren't maintained through constant vigilance. They're sustained by mutual desire, effort, and respect. If you have to chase someone endlessly to keep them, then what you have isn't mutual, it's dependent. By embracing space, you give the relationship the chance to be mutual again. You give the other person the opportunity to choose you without being pushed. And in that choice you find the truth, whether they're capable of showing up for you in the way you need, or whether it's time to walk away. Space doesn't just reveal where they stand, it also shows you where you stand with yourself. Silence often feels like an empty space that needs to be filled, but in reality, it's one of the most revealing forms of communication you'll ever receive. When someone stops talking, stops initiating, or reduces the effort they once gave, that silence isn't random, it's information. It tells you something about their priorities, their level of interest, and their willingness to invest in the connection. The mistake many people make is ignoring that information because they're hoping for a different answer than the one silence is giving them. When you start treating silence as data, you remove a lot of the confusion and emotional chaos that comes from guessing where you stand. You stop reading into single moments, one warm text here, one distracted conversation there, and instead focus on the overall pattern. Patterns are the truth. Moments can be misleading. If someone's overall pattern is silence, then the message is clear, no matter how many small bursts of attention you get in between. This perspective shifts the way you respond. If you see silence as a problem to solve, you'll feel compelled to break it with effort, texts, calls, gestures, anything to get them to speak again. But if you see it as information, you don't rush to fix it. You pause and observe. You ask yourself, what is this telling me about how they see me, about how much they're willing to give, about the place I hold in their life? That self-reflection keeps you from overextending for someone who has already shown you through their inaction where you stand. It's important to remember that silence can be intentional or unintentional. Some people pull back because they're busy or dealing with personal challenges, but others go quiet because they've decided to create distance. The key isn't to demand an immediate explanation every time someone's energy dips. It's to notice whether the silence is part of a consistent pattern and whether that pattern aligns with the kind of relationship you want. Another reason to treat silence as information is because people often reveal their true character, not in what they say, but in how they behave when they're not getting anything from you. When the relationship isn't being actively fed by your effort, do they step forward to maintain it, or do they let it fade? That's one of the purest indicators of their level of investment. Silence also gives you a clearer picture of reciprocity. If you're the one always initiating contact and their side of the conversation dries up without your effort, then their engagement was never truly balanced. It was reactive, not proactive. That's crucial to know because it means you've been sustaining the connection alone. Interpreting silence doesn't mean jumping to conclusions at the first sign of reduced contact.
But it does mean paying attention to whether the silence is broken in a meaningful way. Do they return with genuine effort, or do they only pop back in when it's convenient? Do they acknowledge the gap, or do they act as if nothing happened? The way they handle these moments is part of the data you're collecting. The more you treat silence as information, the more you realize that not every gap needs to be closed by you. In fact, allowing those gaps to exist without immediately filling them creates space for the other person to reveal their intentions. They might step in and show you they value the connection, or they might leave the space untouched, showing you they. Either way, you have clarity without chasing it. Silence is one of the most honest signals in a relationship because it's harder to fake than words. People can say the right things while their actions tell a different story, but sustained silence almost always reflects their true priority. When you pay attention to that instead of drowning it out with your own effort, you learn to respond to reality rather than to wishful thinking. The key is not to see silence as rejection every time, it's simply feedback. And feedback is valuable because it gives you the chance to make an informed decision. You can decide whether their level of engagement meets your standard, or whether it's time to redirect your energy towards someone who won't leave you guessing. Your standard is the invisible boundary that determines the quality of every relationship you have. It's the quiet line you draw, often without announcing it, that says, "This is how I expect to be treated." The moment you allow someone to consistently give you less than that, you're effectively lowering the bar, and once you lower it, it becomes harder to raise again, because you've taught both them and yourself that you'll tolerate the imbalance. Respecting your own standard means you stop chasing people who can't or won't meet it. If someone's energy drops, you don't rush to fill the gap. They either step up or they step out of your life. That doesn't mean you act cold or punish them, it means you operate with self-respect instead of desperation. When your worth isn't tied to their attention, you make decisions from a place of strength, not fear. This also means you stop measuring the relationship by how much you like them and start measuring it by how they show up for you. Liking someone isn't enough to justify accepting inconsistent action. Chemistry, shared history, these things can make you want to hold on, but your standard exists to protect you from letting those emotions override the reality of their behavior. Your standard should be clear to you even if you never speak it out loud. It might be as simple as, "I don't stay in situations where I'm the only one putting in effort." Or if someone doesn't follow through on their words, "I don't make excuses for them." These quiet rules become the foundation for how you navigate connection. Without them, you drift into situations where you're constantly negotiating for scraps of effort, convincing yourself that the little they give is enough. When you have a firm standard, you filter people quickly. You're not swayed by temporary bursts of attention because you know consistency is the real test. You don't get pulled into proving yourself because you understand that the right person values you without having to be convinced. You see withdrawal or inconsistency not as a challenge to fix, but as information that they're not aligned with you. The beauty of holding your standard is that it frees you from the exhausting cycle of guessing where you stand. You don't need constant reassurance because you've already decided you won't stay where the energy is unclear. You don't need to decode mixed signals because you're not interested in building something on shaky ground. This clarity not only protects your self-esteem but also attracts people who respect boundaries and want to match your effort. The moment you start honoring your standard, your relationships change. You stop settling for almost good enough and start making space for people who actually meet your needs. You stop trying to be enough for someone whose inconsistency has nothing to do with your worth. And most importantly, you send a message to others and to yourself that you are not afraid to walk away from anything that costs you your peace. At the heart of it all, relationships thrive on mutual investment, clarity and respect. Silence, distance and inconsistency are never just random, they are signals, decisions, and data that reveal where someone truly stands. The way you respond to those signals defines not only the health of the connection but also your own self-worth. Matching energy, embracing space, and treating silence as valuable information allow you to step out of the exhausting cycle of chasing and into a place of power and clarity. When you honor your standards, you stop negotiating for love and start attracting it in its truest form.